Right now, inside your body, there is a temperature gradient running from the center of your chest to the tips of your fingers. Your core, the deep interior where your heart and liver and kidneys operate, holds steady at approximately 37 degrees Celsius. Your fingertips, depending on what kind of day you have had, might be 15 degrees cooler than that, maybe more. And the thing that determines how steep that gradient is, the thing that decides whether your hands feel warm and alive or cold and slightly numb, is not the thermostat on your wall. It is not the season. It is not even how many layers you are wearing. It is how emotionally depleted you are. That sounds like it belongs in a self-help book rather than a physiology lecture. But the mechanism underneath it is as hard and measurable as anything in thermodynamics. Your autonomic nervous system, the branch of your nervous system that operates without your conscious input, controls the diameter of every blood vessel in your body. When you are emotionally exhausted, when the cumulative weight of stress and grief and decision fatigue and loneliness has drained your capacity to cope, your sympathetic nervous system shifts into a chronic, low-grade activation state that constricts the arterioles feeding your extremities. Less blood reaches your fingers, less heat arrives, the temperature drops. You feel it as cold hands, maybe cold feet, maybe that strange sensation of being chilled from the inside that no blanket quite fixes. The cold is not in the air. The cold is in the signal your brain is sending to your blood vessels. And that signal is a direct readout of your emotional state translated into vascular physics. Let me take this apart properly. Because the connection between what you feel emotionally and what you feel thermally in your own hands is not a metaphor. It is not poetry. It is fluid dynamics governed by smooth muscle contraction, governed by norepinephrine release, governed by hypothalamic stress integration. Every link in that chain is measurable. Every link has been measured. And when you understand the chain, you understand something profound about what emotional exhaustion actually is. It is not just a feeling. It is a physiological configuration. Your body arranges itself differently when you are depleted. And one of the most sensitive indicators of that arrangement is the temperature of your hands. Start with the plumbing. Your cardiovascular system moves roughly 5 liters of blood per minute through a network of vessels whose total length, if you laid them end to end, would stretch over 60,000 miles. That is enough to wrap around the Earth more than twice. Most of that length is capillaries, the microscopic vessels where the actual exchange happens, oxygen leaving the blood, carbon dioxide entering, heat radiating into surrounding tissue. Your hands are extraordinarily rich in these capillary beds. The fingertips contain some of the densest capillary networks in your entire body, not because your fingers need enormous amounts of oxygen, but because your hands are thermal radiators. They are part of your body's temperature regulation system. When you need to dump heat, your hands flush with blood and radiate warmth into the environment. When you need to conserve heat, the blood supply to your hands is throttled back and the warmth stays in your core. The control mechanism for this throttling is not in your hands. It is in the smooth muscle cells wrapped around your arterioles, the small arteries that feed the capillary beds. These smooth muscle cells contract or relax in response to signals from your sympathetic nervous system. Norepinephrine, released from sympathetic nerve terminals embedded in the vessel walls, binds to alpha-1 adrenergic receptors on the smooth muscle cells and triggers contraction. The vessel narrows. Blood flow decreases. The hand cools. Withdraw the norepinephrine signal and the smooth muscle relaxes. The vessel opens. Blood flow increases. The hand warms. This is happening right now in your body. The diameter of the arterioles in your hands is being actively regulated by sympathetic nerve activity at this very moment. And the level of that sympathetic nerve activity is determined, in large part, by your emotional and psychological state. Here is where it gets interesting. Your sympathetic nervous system is not a simple on-off switch. It is not either activated or silent. It has a tonic level, a baseline firing rate that persists even when nothing dramatic is happening. Think of it as a background hum. In a person who is well-rested, emotionally regulated, socially connected, and not under chronic stress, that background hum is relatively quiet. The sympathetic tone is low. The arterioles in the hands are relatively open. blood flows freely to the fingertips, the hands are warm. In a person who is emotionally exhausted, who has been running on fumes for weeks or months, whose capacity to regulate their own emotional responses has been depleted by sustained demand, that background hum is louder. The sympathetic tone is elevated. Not dramatically, not at the level of acute panic or a fight or flight response, but chronically, persistently, like a radio turned up just a few notches above where it should be. And that modest chronic elevation is enough to keep the arterioles in the hands partially constricted, not closed, not cutting off circulation entirely, just narrowed enough that less blood reaches the fingertips. Less heat arrives. The hands are cooler, sometimes noticeably cooler, sometimes cold enough that you wonder why you cannot seem to get warm no matter what you do. The hypothalamus is the integration center where this happens. Sitting at the base of your brain, roughly the size of an almond, the hypothalamus receives inputs from virtually every system that monitors your internal state. It gets information about blood glucose, body temperature, hydration, hormone levels, immune activation, and critically, emotional and psychological stress processed by the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex. The hypothalamus takes all of these inputs and generates an integrated output that sets the tone of your autonomic nervous system. It decides, moment by moment, what the balance should be between sympathetic activation and parasympathetic activation, between mobilization and recovery, between spending energy and conserving it, between warming the periphery and protecting the core. When the inputs from your emotional processing centers consistently signal threat, overwhelm, depletion, or unresolved distress, the hypothalamus shifts the balance towards sympathetic dominance. Not because you are in physical danger, not because a predator is chasing you, but because the neural architecture that processes emotional exhaustion uses many of the same pathways that process physical threat. The amygdala does not distinguish cleanly between the stress of being chased by a lion and the stress of caring for a dying parent while managing financial anxiety and sleeping poorly for 3 months. The signal it sends to the hypothalamus is remarkably similar in both cases. Threat, demand exceeds resources, mobilize, and the hypothalamus responds by raising sympathetic tone, which constricts peripheral blood vessels, which cools your hands. Hugo Critchley, at the University of Sussex, has spent years mapping the relationship between interoception, the brain's perception of the body's internal state, and autonomic regulation. His work demonstrates that the insular cortex, a region buried in the lateral sulcus of the brain, continuously monitors and represents the physiological condition of the body: temperature, heart rate, gut motility, muscle tension, blood pressure. The insula builds a real-time model of how the body feels, and this model feeds directly into emotional experience. When your hands are cold because sympathetic tone is elevated, your insula registers that coldness and incorporates it into your felt sense of your own state. You do not just have cold hands, you feel slightly wrong, slightly uncomfortable, slightly contracted. The peripheral cooling is both a consequence of emotional exhaustion and a contributor to the felt experience of it. The body and the emotion are not separate systems communicating across a gap. They are one system expressing itself simultaneously in physiology and in feeling. There is a specific measurement that captures this beautifully. Peripheral skin temperature, measured at the fingertip with a simple thermistor, correlates with sympathetic nervous system activity more reliably than almost any other non-invasive measure. Researchers studying stress physiology have used fingertip temperature as a proxy for autonomic state for decades. Robert Friedman at Wayne State University published extensively on this in the context of Raynaud's phenomenon, the condition where fingers turn white and numb in response to cold or stress. Friedman showed that the vasospastic episodes in Raynaud's were driven by exaggerated sympathetic responses to stimuli that would not normally trigger significant vasoconstriction. The mechanism was the same as normal cold hands, just amplified, and the amplification was strongly modulated by psychological stress. Patients with Raynaud's had more frequent and more severe episodes during periods of emotional distress. The blood vessels in their fingers were responding to their emotional state with the same physics as everyone else's, just with a lower threshold and a stronger response. But you do not need Raynaud's for this to matter. The ordinary version, the version where your hands just feel cold when you are running on empty, operates through the same pathway at a lower intensity. And it is remarkably common. If you have ever noticed that your hands are colder on days when you are more stressed, more overwhelmed, more emotionally drained, you are not imagining it. You are detecting a real temperature change driven by a real change in blood flow, driven by a real change in sympathetic nerve activity, driven by a real change in how your brain was processing your emotional load. Now here is where the physiology becomes something more than just an interesting fact about blood vessels. The chronic peripheral vasoconstriction that accompanies sustained emotional exhaustion is not just making your hands cold, it is part of a broader physiological pattern that has consequences throughout your body. When sympathetic tone is chronically elevated, it does not only affect the blood vessels in your hands, it affects blood vessels everywhere. It raises resting heart rate slightly. It increases blood pressure slightly. It shifts the balance of your immune system toward inflammation. It suppresses digestive function. It impairs sleep architecture. It reduces heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat variation in your heart rhythm that reflects the flexibility and resilience of your autonomic nervous system. Low heart rate variability is one of the strongest physiological predictors of poor health outcomes across virtually every domain. Cardiovascular disease, depression, chronic pain, cognitive decline all cause mortality. And low heart rate variability is, at its core, a marker of the same thing your cold hands are telling you. Your sympathetic nervous system is running too hot. Your parasympathetic system, the branch that handles recovery, repair, digestion, and calm, is not getting enough airtime. The system is stuck in a mobilization pattern that was designed for short-term emergencies and is being run continuously. Stephen Porges at Indiana University developed what he calls the polyvagal theory to describe the hierarchical organization of the autonomic nervous system. His framework identifies 3 levels. The most evolutionarily ancient is the dorsal vagal complex, which produces immobilization and shutdown, the freeze response. Above that is the sympathetic nervous system, which produces mobilization, fight, or flight. And the most recently evolved is the ventral vagal complex, which produces social engagement, calm alertness, and the capacity for connection. In Porges's framework, emotional exhaustion represents a system that has lost access to the ventral vagal state. The person cannot easily reach the calm, connected, socially engaged mode that characterizes psychological well-being. They are stuck, oscillating between sympathetic activation, the anxious, depleted, running on fumes state, and dorsal vagal withdrawal, the collapsed, numb, cannot get off the couch state. Neither of these states sends the signal that opens the peripheral blood vessels. The ventral vagal state does. Social connection does. Feeling safe does. Feeling resourced does. When you are in a state of genuine ease, genuine connection, genuine safety, your parasympathetic system dominates, your peripheral vessels open, and your hands are warm. The warmth of your hands is, in a very real physiological sense, a measure of how safe your nervous system feels. This is measurable in a laboratory and noticeable in your living room. Think about the last time you were truly relaxed, not distracted, not numbed, not collapsed in exhaustion, but genuinely at ease. Maybe you were with someone you love. Maybe you were in a place that felt completely safe. Maybe you had just finished something that had been weighing on you and the relief was physical. Your hands were warm. You may not have noticed it consciously, but they were. The blood was flowing freely to your fingertips because your sympathetic nervous system had stepped back and your parasympathetic system was running the show. Now think about the last time you were deeply depleted, running on empty for days or weeks, unable to sleep properly, carrying more than you could manage. Your hands were cold. Maybe you noticed, maybe you did not. But the temperature difference was there, written in the diameter of your arterioles, dictated by the firing rate of your sympathetic nerves, determined by the emotional load your hypothalamus was trying to manage. There is an age dimension to this that matters enormously for people over 60. The autonomic nervous system changes with age in ways that compound the effects of emotional exhaustion. Parasympathetic tone naturally decreases with aging. The vagal brake, the mechanism that slows the heart and opens peripheral vessels during rest, becomes less effective. Heart rate variability declines. The system becomes less flexible. less able to shift smoothly between states. At the same time, sympathetic reactivity can increase in certain contexts, particularly in response to psychological stressors. The aging autonomic nervous system is already shifted toward the pattern that emotional exhaustion produces in younger people. It is already slightly more sympathetically dominant, slightly less parasympathetically buffered, slightly more prone to peripheral vasoconstriction. Add emotional exhaustion on top of this age-related shift, the exhaustion of caregiving, of grief, of isolation, of managing chronic illness, of watching your world contract, and the peripheral cooling becomes more pronounced. The hands get colder, the feet get colder. The sensation of being chilled from the inside becomes more persistent. And because it develops gradually, because it tracks with a gradual accumulation of emotional load rather than a sudden event, it is easy to attribute to aging itself rather than to the emotional state that is driving it. Kenneth Friedland, at Washington University in St. Louis, has published extensively on the relationship between depression, autonomic dysfunction, and cardiovascular outcomes in older adults. His work shows that depression in older people is not just a mood disorder, it is an autonomic disorder. Depressed older adults have higher resting heart rates, lower heart rate variability, elevated norepinephrine levels, and impaired baroflex sensitivity compared to non-depressed age-matched controls. The autonomic signature of depression in older adults looks remarkably like the autonomic signature of chronic stress, and both produce peripheral vasoconstriction. Both produce cold hands. The cold hands are not a symptom of depression in the way that sadness is a symptom. They are a physiological consequence of the same autonomic dysregulation that underlies the depression. They are the depression expressing itself in vascular physics. Something happens in the blood itself when emotional exhaustion persists. Chronic sympathetic activation triggers the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor, alpha, C-reactive protein. These inflammatory mediators, released in response to sustained stress signaling, affect the endothelium, the single-cell thick lining of every blood vessel in your body. The endothelium is not just a passive pipe wall, it is an active organ that produces nitric oxide, a vasodilator that maintains vessel dilation and blood flow. Healthy endothelium continuously produces nitric oxide to keep vessels open and responsive. Chronic inflammation damages endothelial function. It reduces nitric oxide production, it makes the vessels stiffer, less responsive, less able to dilate when they should, so the chronic sympathetic activation of emotional exhaustion attacks peripheral blood flow from two directions simultaneously. The sympathetic nerves constrict the vessels from the outside through norepinephrine binding to smooth muscle, and the inflammatory cascade damages the endothelium from the inside, reducing its ability to produce the nitric oxide that would counteract the constriction. Your hands get cold from both sides of the vessel wall at once. Janice Kiekult-Glaser at Ohio State University has documented this inflammatory pathway in caregivers, one of the population's most vulnerable to sustained emotional exhaustion. Her longitudinal studies of spousal caregivers of Alzheimer's patients showed elevated inflammatory markers, impaired wound healing, reduced vaccine responses, and accelerated cellular aging compared to age-matched non-caregivers. The caregivers were not just tired, they were physiologically different. Their immune systems were shifted toward chronic inflammation. Their autonomic systems were shifted toward sympathetic dominance. Their peripheral circulation was compromised. And many of them reported feeling cold, feeling that their extremities were never quite warm enough, feeling a chill that seemed to come from inside rather than from the environment. They were describing the vascular physics of emotional depletion. They were describing what it feels like when your nervous system has been running in emergency mode for so long that it has forgotten how to stand down. There is something else happening in the hands specifically that makes them such a sensitive indicator. Your hands have a unique vascular structure called arteriovenous anastomoses, direct connections between arterioles and venules that bypass the capillary beds entirely. These anastomoses are concentrated in the fingertips, the palms, and the ears. They are controlled almost exclusively by sympathetic nerve activity. When they are open, blood flows rapidly through the hands, dumping heat into the environment. When they are closed, blood is shunted away from the surface and the hands cool dramatically. These anastomoses are far more responsive to sympathetic signals than ordinary capillary beds. They can change the blood flow to your fingertips by a factor of 100, not a percentage change, a 100-fold change, from nearly zero flow when fully constricted to maximum flow when fully open. This is why your hands can feel ice cold while your core temperature has not changed at all. The anastomoses in your fingertips are acting as amplifiers of your sympathetic state. A modest increase in sympathetic tone that you might not notice in your heart rate or your breathing produces a dramatic change in fingertip blood flow because the anastomoses are so exquisitely sensitive to the signal. Your hands are not just affected by your emotional state, they are a high-gain readout of it. They amplify the signal. They make visible what is happening in your autonomic nervous system at a resolution that other body parts cannot match. This is why biofeedback training for stress and anxiety often uses finger temperature as the primary feedback variable. The technique, developed in the 1960s and 1970s at the Menninger Foundation by Elmer and Elise Green, teaches people to raise their hand temperature voluntarily by learning to reduce sympathetic activation. The logic runs in both directions. If sympathetic activation cools the hands, then warming the hands requires reducing sympathetic activation. And reducing sympathetic activation, learning to shift the autonomic balance toward parasympathetic dominance, produces exactly the physiological state associated with calm, recovery, and emotional regulation. The Greens found that people who learned to warm their hands through biofeedback reported reduced anxiety, improved sleep, decreased headache frequency, and a general sense of greater ease. They were not just warming their hands. They were training their autonomic nervous system to shift out of the chronic mobilization pattern. The warm hands were the indicator that the shift had occurred. Modern research on heart rate variability biofeedback operates on the same principle through a different measurement, but the underlying physiology is identical. Train the autonomic system to increase parasympathetic tone. Watch the peripheral indicators respond. Hands warm, heart rate variability increases. Blood pressure decreases, inflammatory markers decrease, sleep improves. The system shifts from chronic mobilization to recovery, from depletion to restoration, from cold hands to warm ones. There is a social dimension to this that matters enormously for people who live alone. Social connection, genuine face-to-face interaction with people who care about you, is one of the most powerful activators of the ventral vagal parasympathetic state. Porges calls it the social engagement system. When you are with someone who feels safe, when you are seen and heard and valued, your nervous system shifts, sympathetic tone decreases, parasympathetic tone increases, peripheral vessels open, hands warm. This is not metaphorical warmth. It produces measurable thermal changes in the periphery because it shifts autonomic balance. Isolation does the opposite. Loneliness, which is epidemic among older adults, is a chronic low-grade stressor that elevates sympathetic tone and suppresses parasympathetic activity. John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago spent decades documenting the physiological effects of loneliness: elevated cortisol, elevated inflammatory markers, elevated sympathetic activity, reduced heart rate variability, impaired sleep, accelerated cognitive decline. Every one of these is a marker of the same autonomic pattern that cools your hands. Loneliness is not just an emotional experience, it is a physiological state, and one of its signatures is peripheral vasoconstriction. Cold hands in an isolated person are not just cold hands. They are the body expressing, in vascular physics, the absence of the social connection that would shift the autonomic balance toward warmth. Your grandmother knew this. She would have said, "Come sit with me," or "Let me make you some tea," or "Tell me what is bothering you." And if you did, if you sat with her and talked and felt heard, your hands would have warmed. Not because of the tea, though holding a warm cup helps through a different mechanism, but because the social engagement, the feeling of being safe with another person, shifted your autonomic state. The parasympathetic system engaged, the sympathetic system stepped back. The arterioles in your hands relaxed. Blood flowed. Heat arrived. You felt warmer. You felt better. The two feelings were the same feeling, expressed in different languages. One emotional, one thermal. Both real, both physiological, both originating in the same autonomic shift. The temperature of your hands affects your emotional state, not just the other way around. This is bidirectional causation operating through the insular cortex. When your hands are warm, your insula registers warmth and incorporates it into your felt sense of your own state. Warm hands contribute to a felt sense of safety, ease, and social connection. Lawrence Williams and John Bargh published a study in Science in 2008 showing that people who briefly held a warm cup of coffee subsequently rated a stranger as having a warmer personality than people who held an iced coffee. The thermal sensation influenced social judgment. The mechanism runs through the insula, which processes both physical temperature and social warmth using overlapping neural circuits. This means that warming your hands externally, holding a warm cup, using a heating pad, taking a warm bath, sends a signal to your brain that subtly shifts your autonomic state toward parasympathetic dominance. It is a small effect. It is not a cure for emotional exhaustion, but it is a real physiological intervention that operates through a documented neural pathway. Your grandmother handing you a cup of tea was not just being kind. She was, through a mechanism neither of you understood, providing a thermal input that shifted your autonomic balance toward the state in which recovery becomes possible. There is a specific practice that the research supports with particular strength for this exact problem. Slow breathing, deliberately slowing your respiratory rate to approximately 6 breaths per minute, roughly 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out, activates the baroreflex, a feedback loop between your blood pressure sensors and your brainstem that increases parasympathetic outflow when stimulated at this frequency. The baroreflex operates at a resonant frequency of approximately 0.1 Hz, which corresponds to a breathing rate of 6 cycles per minute. When you breathe at this rate, you drive the baroreflex at its resonant frequency, amplifying the parasympathetic signal. Heart rate variability increases, sympathetic tone decreases, peripheral vessels dilate, hands warm. This is not meditation in the vague sense. This is mechanical stimulation of a specific neural feedback loop at its resonant frequency. The physics is precise. The effect is measurable within minutes. Paul Lehrer at Rutgers University has published extensively on this mechanism. 5 minutes of resonant frequency breathing produces measurable changes in autonomic balance that persist beyond the breathing session itself. Practiced daily, it gradually retrains the autonomic system toward greater parasympathetic capacity. I want to be honest about something. If you are deeply emotionally exhausted, if you have been running on empty for months or years, if the demands on you are ongoing and you cannot simply remove them, breathing exercises alone will not fix this. The autonomic pattern of chronic depletion is maintained by real circumstances. Caregiving that does not end, grief that has no resolution, isolation that has no easy remedy, financial stress that persists, health problems that accumulate. The cold hands are telling you something true about your situation, not just about your breathing pattern. Addressing the signal requires addressing the source, and sometimes the source cannot be fully addressed. Sometimes the best available option is to reduce the load where possible, increase the recovery inputs where possible, and accept that the system is operating under sustained demand that it was not designed for. Even partial interventions help. Even modest reductions in sympathetic tone produce measurable improvements in peripheral circulation, sleep quality, inflammatory markers, and subjective well-being. The system does not need to be perfectly balanced to function better than it is functioning now. It just needs more parasympathetic input than it is currently receiving. The hands are where you feel it first. Before you notice that your sleep has deteriorated, before you recognize that your mood has shifted, before you acknowledge that you are running on empty, your hands get cold. The arterioles constrict, the blood retreats toward the core, the fingertips cool, and if you are paying attention, if you notice the cold and ask what it means, rather than just reaching for gloves, your hands are telling you something important. They are telling you that your nervous system is spending more than it is earning, that the demands on your emotional resources exceed the recovery inputs, that the system is in deficit. The cold is not the problem. The cold is the messenger, and the message is that something needs to change, not your hand temperature, your life, or at least the balance within it between what depletes you and what restores you. Your grandmother would not have said it this way. She would have looked at your hands, felt how cold they were, and said something simple. You are working too hard. You need to rest. Come sit down, let me make you something warm. And she would have been right. She was always right. The physiology just took a few decades to explain what she could feel in the temperature of your fingers.